Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about for loops and while loops, break and continue statements using cool functions like enumerate, zip longest, and also about the else keyword supported by the for loop. In Python, there are for loop and while loops, which executes statements several times based on few conditions. Let's see them both side by side to see how it works. For loop is created by using for keyword followed by a variable that we are going to use to iterate over the sequence, followed by in operator and a container like lists, string, tuples or dictionary. We end it with a colon. The statements below the for loop, which are indented, are going to be executed until the container is iterated fully or until we end it ourselves. So let me just print the value of I under the for loop. The value of I is going to be the elements of the list. We iterate over the elements of the lists with I, and when we have exhausted the elements of the list, then the for loop ends. So every time I is going to take the element of the list in a sequential manner. So if I run this code, we can see that it prints every element in the list one by one. So if I have a string instead of the list, the elements here is the character of the string, and it prints every characters of the string. There is a function called range, which is used when we want to iterate over a range of numbers. I can specify the starting and ending number, and it is iterated from the starting number up to the ending number minus 1. The ending number is exclusive, so if we want to loop from 0 to 10, we specify 11 here, so that 10 is included. If I run, it prints up to 10, but if I had 10 in the range, then it would have printed only up till 9. If we don't specify a starting number, it defaults starting from 0. Range can also take a third argument, which acts as an interval. So if I want a range of even numbers from 0 to 10, I specify 0, 11 and 2. So every second element from 0 is printed up till 10. An if statement just executes the statement inside it one time if the condition given to it evaluates to true, but a while loop executes the statements contained inside it as long as the condition evaluates to true. First, let me have I equals 0. A while loop is created by while keyword, and it is followed by an expression that evaluates to either true or false. Let me have a condition I less than 5, and we end it with a colon. Inside the while loop, let me print the value of I and increment I by 1. So at first I is 0, the condition I less than 5 is true, and statements inside the while loop becomes valid now. So I is printed and I is incremented by 1. Now as soon as the control reaches the end of the while loop, it goes again to the beginning to check the condition, and since we had I incremented in the loop, it turns 0 to 1. So the value of I is 1 now. The statements are executed and again I is incremented. This happens until I is incremented to 4. When I is 5, the condition fails as 5 is not less than 5 and the while loop ends. So we can see that it printed up to 4 but not 5, since the condition fails when I is 5. The variable inside the condition specified inside a while loop should be affected inside its body in order for it to terminate. If I don't have this increment, the value of I will not change, it will remain 0 and the condition will always hold true. This is different from the for loop in that the next element in the sequence is automatically pointed by I without mentioning about it. We can control the execution of loops with break and continue keywords. If I don't want the for loop to iterate over all elements of the list, I can specify a break keyword when I want it to stop. For example, if I want to search if the number 3 is in the list, I can have an if condition to check if the value of I matches the number. If it matches the value, then I don't have any need to continue the loop, as I've already found that 3 is indeed in the list. So now I can stop the for loop forever using the break keyword. Any statement after the break inside the for loop is not executed. If I print it, you can see that it printed only up to 2. And as soon as I found 3, I broke out of the loop forever. Now if I use continue instead of break here, we can see every element in the list except 3 is printed. Continue skips the current iteration of the loop and resumes from the next element in the list. Assume I wanted to print only even numbers in the list. I don't want to break out of the loop if it finds out an odd number. I just want to skip the odd number and print only the even numbers. That is exactly done by the continue keyword. So I check that if the number is evaluated to an odd number, I use continue to skip that odd number and continue on with the remaining elements. And the statements below it are not executed if it hits continue. So print of I will not be executed if I is odd. If the number is even, the if condition fails and continue statement is never encountered. So it just prints I. If I run, you can see it prints only even numbers. We can also implement the same in while loop. Let me break if I becomes 3. We can see that it prints only up to 2. So if I try to change break from continue and if I try to run it, you can see that it is stuck at 2 and it's not executing anything. It is stuck in the loop forever. So if I press Ctrl C to stop it, and the problem is when I becomes 3, it executes the continue statement, and since the increment is after the continue statement, the value of I is never incremented once it reaches 3. So I is always 3 and it never becomes 4. So if I try to change it by incrementing the value at the top, you can see that it works fine and everything except 3 is printed. But you can see that it starts from 1 rather than 0. If you want to access the list elements and also need to keep track of the index value of the element, you can try something like this. You can have a variable like a count and increment it as a way to keep track of the index. So if we run it, we can see the index along with the elements of the lists. Or something like using a range of length of list. So the index is high here and the element of the list is printed by movies of I. That is, we use indexing to print its value like Godzilla and so on. But these are kind of naive approaches, and enumerate is a good approach to solve this. Enumerate returns two values. The first is the index of the element and second is the value of the element itself. So if we used two variables in the for loop to get the two values returned by the enumerate, we can see that it can print both index and the movie name, that is the elements of the list. Let's have two lists here. Assume that list 1 contains first name and second list contains the last name. If we want to print the full name, it is achieved by printing both the elements of the lists at the same time. For example, Sherlock from list 1 and Holmes from list 2, Peter Parker, and so on. Now if you want to iterate over 2 or more lists in a parallel manner, that is printing the full name in our case, then a naive approach is accessing the list elements by index. So if I run it, we get both the names as we iterated both lists in a parallel manner using index of the two lists. The better way is to use the zip function, which can take the lists as arguments. So we use two variables as we have two lists. So if I print x and y and run it, we can see that the lists are accessed in a parallel manner and the full name is printed as expected. But assume that I have a name which doesn't have a last name. Let's have the name as Levin. I'm pretty sure she doesn't have a full name. Not sure how Hopper going to convince the government. So the last name list has an element less than the first name list. We cannot use the zip function A zip function will only print values until both the lists are of the same size. If we run the program, we see that 11 is completely ignored. In order to print this, we can use the zip longest from the itertools library. Just type from itertools import zip longest. Now if I replace zip with zip longest and run the program, we can see that 11 is printed, but it has a none value appended to it. By default, if the lists are of different sizes, the one with the less size is filled with none. We can change the default value by using fill value argument. If I pass an empty string, we can now get the correct results with 11 with only first name. Although this might sound strange, for loops used with break also support an else condition. The else is ignored if break is encountered within the loop at least once. But if the for loop never hits the break condition, then the else block will be executed. This might be helpful in several cases when we want to check if the break is encountered or not. So if I have an example here, I have a list of numbers and I want to check if the list contains an odd number. If it is found, then I have to print that odd number is found and I have to break from the loop. You can see that 9 is an odd number in the list. If I run, it prints the value, and when 9 is encountered, it says odd number found and breaks out of the loop. As it broke out of the loop, the else condition is never executed. Now if I remove 9 from the list does not contain any odd number. So the program never hits the break keyword. So if I want to know that explicitly, I can have an else condition that runs when the for loop is never broken. I can safely print that the list does not contain odd number as the break is never encountered. So if I run, you can see the message in the else block. For loop containing another for loop is called nested for loop. Here the inner loop will be run fully for every outer loop iteration. So if outer loop contains a list of numbers and the inner loop contains a string like ABC in our case, it will produce the combination like 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B, and so on. Nested for loop can be used to print complex patterns and more useful purposes. But as the input increases, the time it takes to run increases very much.